Step one is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. So I always start by asking, why do you think it starts with the word we and not I? It's telling me what I need to admit, right? But it starts with we. So why do you think? Just before it spells out the steps in the big book, it says, these are the steps we took which are suggested as a program of recovery. These are the steps that the 100+ people who were already sober when they wrote the book were actually doing, had done to recover from their alcoholism. And this is why all the steps are written in the past tense, because they had already done them. So when I read the steps, I kind of have to translate them into the present tense. They admitted, I'm admitting. But this is the we. Plus, it's also, if it worked for all of them, maybe it'll work for me too. I mean, how many of you guys spent time alone trying to figure this out, thinking you might be the only one suffering from it? I did for sure. So I like to look words up because I only think I know what they mean, and having a clear understanding is important for a lot of this stuff. So I look up the word admit, and the dictionary defines it as to accept the truth, often begrudgingly, which makes this the perfect word for step one. Because nobody's skipping and happy about being an addict or an alcoholic. But I have to be able to look at that truth and accept it, even if it's begrudgingly. Powerlessness is defined as lacking the capacity to act or devoid of resources or strength. And unmanageable is defined as difficult or impossible to control. Addiction is seen as a threefold disease in the 12-step world: physical, mental, and spiritual. The physical part of the disease has to do with the fact that when I put drugs and alcohol in my body reacts differently than so-called normal drinkers, normal drug users. Well, I didn't know any of those, but when I put it in me, it produces this phenomenon of craving that never happens in normal drinkers. And I have to be able to look at my own history and see if I can see examples of that. The mental part has to do with the mental obsession. That thing that when I try to stop, I can't stay stopped. I always find some excuse to pick back up again. And the spiritual part is at the core of it all. Spiritual is the solution that helps me stay sober without struggling. So step one is two separate pieces. Powerless over drugs and alcohol, our lives have become unmanageable. And I want to look at each of the two halves independently. So the first part, powerlessness. I hated powerless when I got here. The first time I read that, I'm in treatment. Not powerless. Nope, not powerless. Powerful Chris, not powerless. Completely insane, heavily armed, willing to overreact Chris. That's who I am. But when it comes to drugs and alcohol, I am lacking the capacity to act. Once I put it in me, I have no choice about what happens. And that's something I have to get my head around. The powerlessness in the first half of the first step is directly related to the physical allergy, the physical part of the disease. When I put it in me, I don't always know what's going to happen. And for most of us, like if every time any of us put any alcohol or anything else in our systems, it turned into a 6-week-long debacle that ended in a hospital or a jail cell, we might notice we had a problem. And for a few people, that's the truth. But for most of us, what it looks like is I literally don't know what's going to happen when I start. And it's getting my head around the idea that powerless doesn't mean I can't ever control how much I drink or use. It means I can't always control how much I drink or use. And that's the big differentiation. That's the place where I struggled a lot, because sometimes I could. You know, sometimes I would go out and want 2 beers, and I'd have 2 beers and it'd be great. And other times I'd go out and I'd want 2 beers and I'd have 6, but I didn't drive. It's okay. And other times I'd go out and I'd only have 4, but then somebody would give me Coke, and that was totally not the plan. I have to go to bed at some point. And then other times I go out and have 2 beers again. And then one time I go out to have 2 beers and spend 5 days in a hotel off of Runberg shooting heroin, smoking crack with a girl I just met. And I wanted 2 beers, and I have no idea why that happened. You know, and my disease likes to make me ask, why can't it always be like the day when I had 2? Which is the wrong question. It can't be like that because it can't be like that, or it would be like that. The right question is, why do I keep trying when it keeps going this other way all the time? What is it about me that makes me want to keep trying or need to keep trying when it just doesn't ever go 2 beers for me very often? So I want to look at the physical allergy, look at what it looks like. There's research being done into this finally, and one of the bits of research they're doing on alcohol specifically suggests that the phenomenon of craving with alcohol may be a metabolic issue, how the alcohol is metabolized. And the study I read said that alcohol goes through 4 metabolic changes before it just becomes sugar that my body can either burn or store. And in the third one, it's producing a derivative of acetone that in the normal drinker is produced and reabsorbed in a matter of seconds, and an alcoholic it can last up to half an hour in their bloodstream. And they think this might be the driver for that phenomenon of craving. So I had drank my first beer, and how long do I wait for the next one? Half an hour? No. However long it takes to get to the fridge, right? So then I have 2, and I have twice as much in me. That makes me want the third one more than I wanted the second one. And then I have the third one. And it keeps building. And you can look at this and see how that sort of cascades on you. Any of you guys have the experience of wanting the 20th beer more than you wanted the 10th? You know? Yeah. I have a memory of being run over in the parking lot of a nightclub in Kansas City that my band had just played at. And people came running out to me and said, "What can we do for you? What can we do?" And I said, "Give me another beer. It's last call." And I spilt mine. You know, we'll worry about my legs in a minute. Because all I really wanted was another drink at that point. So I need to look at how that works in me. Also, with meth and with cocaine, the phenomenon of craving, I believe, well, the studies are starting to show that that's a prefrontal cortex issue, but the same sort of thing happens. Once I put it in me, it triggers this thing that makes me want more. With opiates, it's a little different. If it worked with opiates the same way it worked with alcohol or coke or meth, all the opiate addicts would just overdose right out of the gate, you know? But with opiate addicts, what happens is you put it in you and you feel good for a while. And then 5 or 6 hours into being high, as the level begins to taper off, I'm still pretty high, mind you, but as the level begins to go down, that phenomenon of craving starts happening. And I start thinking about ways I'm gonna need to get high again soon. And if you've been dope sick in withdrawals more than a couple of times, you add the fear of that to the equation, and it's a powerful motivator. So I need to look at this idea that powerless doesn't mean I can't ever control, it means I can't always control. And what does my own drinking and using history show? You're here in this place where nobody's mad at you, and you're not having to try to explain anything, and you've got some time outside of time. And you can look at your own drinking and using history and see, do I see examples of that phenomenon of craving? Do I see examples of the lack of ability to always control how much I drink or use once I start? And if you do, then you've found some examples of powerlessness in your own drinking and using history. It's important that you know this about you. It doesn't matter if everybody else knows, because if you don't believe it, then you won't seek a solution. Part 2 of the first step is the unmanageability. When I first got sober, this seemed like a gimme, right? I mean, my life was chaos. I was living in a house that was slowly being shoved off its foundation by the dirt from up the hill that was pushing it sideways. We had a fire, and the only reason we didn't die in the fire was because a box of bullets caught fire and went off and woke us up, shooting up the house. And we put the fire out ourselves, and we didn't move because we couldn't afford to. We just didn't tell the landlord. We just didn't use that part of the house anymore. And every time I leave the house, it's a felony, and everything on my car is expired or forged. And I'm having to lower my standards faster than I can figure out a way to do that in order to be who I need to be to get what I need to do done. Of course, my life's unmanageable. But then they explained to me that that's not unmanageability. That's delusion. You can't live the way I was living and not have those consequences. Those consequences are the direct result of how I'm living. The unmanageability in the first step doesn't have to do with that stuff. We're going to look at that stuff later, but the unmanageability in the first step has everything to do with the mental obsession. That part of the disease that keeps me drinking and using even if I don't want to. So the big book says the idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. So we got to look at this mental obsession and try and understand what it means. This is how it works. If I can draw a picture here. Here's my allergy. Here's the spiritual malady. And here's the mental obsession. So when I start drinking and using, I begin to have consequences, right? I mean, if I could drink or use and never have any consequences, I just drink or use. Who cares, right? But eventually the consequences start happening. Stuff like jail, overdose. What else? What are the other consequences? What are the things that happen to you when you're drinking and using? Hospitals. Yeah. Lose job, family, kids, suicide, right. Homeless. And eventually, these things start piling up. And I hit a place where either because I'm forced to, because I'm locked up or in a hospital, or because somebody tells me, if you don't stop, you're not part of the family anymore, we're going to take your kids, we're going to whatever. So that drives me over here and I try to stop. But what happens when I don't have any drugs and alcohol to help me deal with the problem of being Chris? I get irritable, restless, and discontent. I get angry. I get a little nuts. My emotions are completely out of control. I get emotional. Right, I get sensitive. That's a good one. And this just gets worse and worse and worse. And then that makes me start telling stories. You know, I start floating ideas past myself. Like, well, just one. What else? Yes, just the weekend. Yeah. So it's not just one, it's just 3 days. Just. Right. Right. Everybody hates me. That's okay. Everybody hates me. May as well get loaded. May as well. It's just once. It'll be different. Right. Right. There's something wrong with me. And ultimately, at the end, it's F it, right? If I can't make any of the other ones stick, I get to that place where screw it, I don't care. You know, they say insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. But for us, at the end of our disease, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, knowing exactly what's going to happen and doing it anyway. Because the misery of this is better than the misery of this. At least it seems like it at the moment. And then once I put the drugs and alcohol back in me, the whole thing starts again. Over and over and over. The only way to treat it is to deal with this right here. And that's where the rest of the steps begin to come in. So there are several types of mental obsessions. There's the intrusive obsession, which is a thought that seems to come out of nowhere. Like I'm minding my business, I'm doing pretty good, and suddenly, bam, it's in my head. And once it's in there, the only way to make it go away is to get high. Then there's the recurring obsession. That's like the gnawing hum in the background that never goes away. I'm trying to do my best, but it's like swimming underwater. I can only hold my breath for so long. Then there's this circumstantial obsession. This is where I think I'm doing pretty good and I haven't been drinking or using or whatever. And then I find myself in a situation with the opportunity to drink and I can't think my way out of it. Like, I've been doing great, and then I'm at a wedding. I've been doing great, and then one of my friends breaks out some blow. And I can't think my way out of it. And then the last one is the fundamental obsession. And this is where a lot of us spend a lot of time. It says it's usually hard to identify the fundamental obsession at first. We're so familiar with it that it's hard to see. Life is unsatisfying. We're constantly agitated and restless. No matter what we try, we can't seem to be able to put any kind of peace of mind together. We're constantly trying to adjust the circumstances of our lives in an attempt to find some comfort, and at a fundamental level, we believe that alcohol and drugs are the solution for this condition. So what I have to do is I have to examine my own drinking and using history and see if I can find examples of this mental obsession. The stories where I talked myself into getting high again. Or the place where the obsession overtook me and I had no choice. Because at its most powerful, what the obsession looks like is I'm doing good. Maybe I've been sober for a few days, not doing anything. And I'm going along and everything's fine. And then suddenly the thought that it's time to get high pops into my head. And I go, no, I'm not doing that. But the thought's still in there like a worm boring its way in. It's time to get high. It's time to get high. It's time to get high. And I can fight that for a little while. But pretty soon, I keep telling myself, I don't want to. It's time to get high. I don't want to. It's time to get high. And I don't want to. And I'm making phone calls. And I don't want to. And I'm pawning stuff I don't own. And I don't want to. And I'm knotted out on the floor of a Texaco on East 7th Street. And I didn't even want to. That never happens to normal drinkers. But it happens to us. I used to have a thing in the band I was in the late 80s and early 90s called the stare down. Me and the bass player, he's one of us too. He had to leave the band shortly after this to go to prison to deal with some of the consequences of his addiction. But we had a thing called the stare down, where we wouldn't drink or get high or anything all day long, and for us that meant from about noon till 5. And then at 5 o'clock, we'd sit down and pour 2 pint glasses completely full of Jack Daniels and put just a splash of Coke in it for bubbles and 2 ice cubes. And then we would stare at it because neither of us wanted to drink it. And we would stare at it till the ice melted and the glass got sweaty, and neither of us wanted to drink it because we knew what it meant. But we had to go do our job, which should have been fun and awesome, going to playing for a large crowd of people who were super excited to see you play the music that you wrote and that you love. But it was miserable and it was torture because we were both heroin addicts, and you can't have heroin on the road. And eventually, after 20 or 30 minutes, one of us would drink the whole thing in one go. The other one would follow suit, and then the evening was going to do whatever it did. And I didn't want to drink that for for every bit of me didn't want to get that ball rolling again, and I did it every single night. It had a name. I didn't know that wasn't normal. So it's important that you look at your drinking and using history and see, can you find examples of when you wanted to stop, you couldn't? Because the unmanageability in the second half of the first step doesn't have anything to do with that chaos. The simplest way to understand it is when I make a decision to stop drinking and using, no action I take manages that decision. I can do everything I want, but I can't make that decision stick. It's not manageable. So I have to look at my own drinking and using history so I can see the truth about myself. If you're an opiate addict, or heroin, cocaine, or meth brought you in here, it's also important that you look at your using history and your relationship to like beer and weed. Because those things tend to push the same buttons. But for me, like, I spent a year arguing with a nurse at a methadone clinic who was trying to help me save my life about why I had to give up beer, even though I hadn't had a beer in 18 months, because I read an article that said the alcohol would flush the heroin out of my system quicker, and I didn't want to ruin my high, so I stopped drinking. I was trying to be all I could be, But I didn't want to give up beer, right? And then a guy who worked at the treatment center, who had a job like mine, sat me down and we had a short conversation and looked at my drinking and using history. And what my history looked like was I'd get off of heroin, but I'd keep drinking. And the allergy in me for alcohol is fairly weak. It takes 3 or 4 drinks to really kick it over. So I could go out and have a couple of beers now and then. But relatively quickly, I'm not having a couple of beers because I want a beer. I'm having a couple of beers because I'm really uncomfortable inside. And so I don't have 2, I have 10. And I drink them really fast. And at some point in there, I start getting sloppy drunk, and I still have 2 or 3 in my stomach that aren't even in my bloodstream yet. And I tend to do that in a room where somebody's got powder in their pocket. And I can find those people in the dark. And as soon as I talk one of them into giving me some coke or some meth, every single time within 2 weeks I'm back on heroin. Every time. That's my history. You know, so it's no safe way for me to drink or smoke pot. And there's a thing in the brain called the hedonic response, right? This has to do with the pleasure response in the brain. And the whole point of the pleasure response in the brain is to reinforce behaviors that are good for my survival and survival of the species. That's why they evolved. So when I eat good food, I get this release of dopamine, right? And it goes, oh, do that again, that was good. And when I have sex, I get a bigger release of dopamine. Do that again, that was good, that'll make more people, that's good. And then when I do cocaine or meth, it goes all the way off the chart. Same with heroin. And see, in a normal person, you've got this line, and anything above that line, you get enough dopamine, and you go above that line, you go, that is necessary for survival, do that again. But I start hammering this up here over and over and over again, and the line moves up, right? It's why a lot of us don't eat. Stop thinking about sex, unless you're on meth.
That's right.
Because that bell's getting rung so hard that these things barely even count. And the problem is, while beer or weed don't do what cocaine or meth or heroin do, they do this. They push it up higher. And once I've trained my brain to respond this way, it keeps happening. Whether that's a genetic predisposition or whether my brain learned how to do it because I shoved chemicals through it for a long time, kind of doesn't matter. The pickle won't ever be a cucumber again. You know, the wiring changes. And I got to understand what my relationship is. And if you have doubts about that, please make sure you talk about them. Find me, I'll talk to you about them. We had a little brother come through here about a year ago after an overdose that put him in a coma for a couple of days. And he came to us and he did everything we asked him to do. He was terrified of ever going back to heroin. But he never said out loud that he thought he could still drink. The first night he got out of here, he got drunk at the sober house, but they didn't catch him. The next morning, they woke him up at 7 a.m., and they woke everybody else up, and at 10 a.m., they found him unresponsive with alcohol poisoning in the yard. He had to go to the hospital again, and he got kicked out. He was homeless for a while, and he finally got into a mission, and then eventually we got him back in here. Unfortunately, when he finished his 30 days here, he had to go to Del Valle for a bit because he caught some charges while he was on the street. And he got out of there after 6 months, and he's still struggling to put time together because he's still struggling with his relationship to beer in the first step. He knows he can never safely do heroin again, but the alcohol has taken him to a place the opiates never did. So if you have doubts about this, find somebody and talk to them. And I'll tell you right now, I got nothing to sell. I don't care if you're an addict or not, but I'll happily help you look at your history and see what it looks like to us. I'm not here to convince you. Maybe you're not an alcoholic or an addict. Maybe you're just like the rest of the guys in my bands who are dumb enough to hang out with some serious alcoholics and addicts. Like, you couldn't look at the guys in my band in 1990 and tell which ones were going to be the drug addicts and which ones weren't. In fact, if you looked at us in 1990, I was not the guy you'd have picked. A couple of the other guys in the band they were a nightmare. And then the band broke up and they got a little older and they just knocked that stuff off and got married and had kids and they drink on the weekends and they're fine. Me, not so much. You know, I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. So it's important you know your relationship to this stuff. Does my history show that I have that physical allergy? Can I find examples of the phenomenon of craving? Can I find examples of the lack of ability to control how much I drink or use? Does my history show an inability to stay sober even when I want to or need to really, really bad? When I try to stop drinking and using, does it get easier to be me or harder to be me? These are the questions I have to ask myself. So one of the things I want to say that nobody really says out loud very much is admitting that I'm an alcoholic and an addict is terrifying. The reason I wanted to hold on to that beer so hard was because it was terrifying. What you were asking me to do was let go of everything that I had ever found that made it easier to be me, that solved the problem of being Chris. Because just being me was miserable. I had to have something. But the truth is, unless I'm willing to let go entirely of the other stuff, I won't go get experience with this other solution that does the job better and almost never gets you arrested. But I have to be able to completely let go of the old way and shut that door and leave myself no place to go back to. Because otherwise, I go, well, maybe I could smoke pot eventually. And as soon as something gets scary or uncomfortable or I get asked to do something in the program that I don't want to do, I'll just go do that. But that always leads back to where I started. So the last thing here is, if I really believe I'm an acting alcoholic, based on looking at my own drinking and using history and the ideas we've just talked about, then I have to understand that there are only two possible outcomes to that truth. One is, I'm going to drink or use whether I want to or not until I die, probably not soon, and do everything I can to blot out how miserable my life is. I mean, everybody goes, live fast, die young, but nobody ever does the math. Most of us don't die. We're just miserable forever. I didn't get sober because I was afraid of dying. I got sober because I couldn't stay dead. I was dead 4 times in the last 6 months I was using it. People kept bringing me back. And the thing that scared me more than dying was 10 or 15 more years of living how I had been living for the last few months. That was flat out terrifying. But if I am truly an acting alcoholic, then I'm either going to drink or use whether I like it or not, or I can actively pursue some sort of program of recovery. And the key word there is actively. This isn't the hang out with sober people, go to meetings, stay happy situation. This is I have to actively practice a program of recovery every day. And that sounds daunting, but it really isn't. The dangerous thing for a lot of us is that there are a lot of people out there staying sober in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and the other fellowships who aren't actively pursuing a program of recovery. They went to treatment, they worked the steps once a long time ago, they hang out with a lot of sober people, they do a lot of sober stuff, they pray once in a while, and when life gets really, really hard, they hold their breath and hope they make it through. But eventually that becomes too much, and they have to start over if they don't go to jail or die first. But if I'm willing to develop a daily practice based on the reality that I'm an addict and an alcoholic, my life can grow beyond my wildest dreams. So it's important while you're here, spend some time thinking about your drinking and using history. Get quiet with it. Meditate on it a little bit. Maybe do some writing about it. If you need to talk to somebody, come find me or come find one of the other folks that works here that's in recovery and talk to them about what you're thinking. Be honest about it. Your life may depend on it. Now, for the last couple of minutes here, I want to talk about how the Big Book is laid out. First off, the reason we use the Big Book is because every 12-step fellowship except Narcotics Anonymous uses the Big Book as their basic text. The language is archaic. It was written by an upper middle class white guy in the 30s. But if you can get through the language to the ideas in there, it's the basic text. It's where the basic ideas come from, so that's why we teach from it. Even though most of you came in here on the heels of drugs as well. So how the book is set up, I want to talk about it because I don't want to assume you've done this before. So in the beginning, There are Roman numerals. It's got a preface. It's got forewords. Every time they put out a new edition, they write a new foreword because alcoholics can't ever stand to throw anything away. And then there's the doctor's opinion. Doctor's opinion was written by Dr. Silkworth, who ran Towns Hospital in New York. At the time the book was being written, he'd been treating alcoholics for 10 or 15 years. And he's the one who first came up with the idea that the way an alcoholic responds to alcohol is a result of an allergy that doesn't happen in regular drinkers. And so they asked him to write this doctor's opinion. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of research being done now, and before long it may not be an opinion, it may be medical fact. But we won't change what it's called because alcoholics don't like change either. But then once you get past the Roman numerals, you have the basic chapters. You have Bill's story of one of our founders. You got There's a Solution, which talks more about alcoholism and introduces the spiritual solution. We Agnostics, which I thought was going to tell me how to work this program without all the God business, but doesn't. It's a discussion of the spiritual nature of the solution. And then you get How It Works, Into Action, and Working with Others. These are the chapters where the program of action is laid out. This is where the meat of the program happens. Then we have To Wives, The Family Afterward, and To Employers. We also refer to these as the missing chapters because alcoholics don't read them because they're not about us. There's still good stuff in there. I suggest you wander through them at least once in a while. And then at the end, there's a vision for you that re-examines alcoholism and talks about what's possible in recovery. Then in the back of the book, there are a whole bunch of personal stories. You have to remember, when the book was written, it was sent out into a world where there were no meetings and no sober people. People were ordering it through the mail. And you were the only person in your town that was reading this book. And one of the things that makes the program work is the idea of identification. When I listen to another addict or an alcoholic talk about their own drinking and using, and then they start talking about their recovery, their life sounds familiar to me. I start to think that maybe if I do what they did, I can get what they're getting. And that's why the stories are included. That's why Bill's story's at the beginning. That's why all the personal stories are at the end. Because it helps with that identification. It was vital when the book was first launched into the world, but they're still really powerful now. So if you find yourself with some downtime, go read one of the stories in the back and see if you can identify with the person who's telling the story. And then at the end, there are some appendices. The one that's of the most interest to us is one called Spiritual Experience. If you're wondering what all the talk of spiritual awakening and spiritual experience is, this is a great couple of pages that sort of help explain kind of what the mechanism is and what it looks like so that you know that you're headed in the right direction. So take some time while you're here. Think about the first step. Come talk to me if you're struggling with it. I'm happy to meet with any of you one-on-one. We can set something up. And because it's real important that you know your truth, because otherwise you just won't seek the rest of the solution if you don't really believe you have the problem. That's all I got today, guys. Thanks.